Hello folks and good day. This is the very first video in my design series. Yes, for those that jumped on the wagon early, I produced some of these earlier videos out of order. I apologize. I'll be using past students' work, my own examples, and some from the industry-leading artists as I break down what design is and how we can use it. I will roll out the rest of these videos as I have the availability to do so. Some content will be similar from my courses and even my mentorship program, but these videos will be aimed at giving the most very direct information in a systematic way. So in this first part, what we'll be looking at is what is design, followed by what is good design. Then we'll break down the elements and the principles, and then we're going to start off by focusing on lines, shapes, and patterns. Let's begin. So now back to defining design. What is it? Well, by definition, it's an outline, a sketch or plan, as of the form and the structure of a work of art, an edifice, or a machine to be executed or constructed. And that's from the dictionary reference. So it's really kind of vague, and it doesn't really specify much in terms of how it could work or how it's even utilized. Now, the definition, of course, has changed over time, and a little bit more of a refined one that I do like from Paul Ralph and Yarwan, some mid-century designers, is a specification of an object manifested by some agent intended to accomplish goals in a particular environment using a set of primitive components satisfying a set of requirements subject to some restraints. Now, I believe one of them was an architect, and this design definition here is a lot more specific. It gives us the fact that we do need a goal to accomplish. There needs to be an intention behind our design. It also brings up the idea of restraints. Now, restraints is a huge thing because everything we design in the entertainment industry is going to either have budget restraints, technology restraints, stylistic restraints. The restraints are there, and they're actually going to derive our creativity. But it's still that's a pretty complicated definition of this. And if I could simplify that, because I do think brilliant design comes from simplification, one of my favorite definitions of design is from Charles Emmes, and that is a plan for arranging elements to accomplishing our particular purpose. I just like it. It says it all. And with that really caters to the arts. Design is inherent in the full range of art disciplines, from painting to drawing to sculpture, photography, time-based media such as film, video, computer video games. It's integral to crafts as well, such as ceramics, textiles, and glass. It comes into play with architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, all apply visual design principles. The list could go on. Design is in everything. It's the very act of creating, and that's creating literally anything. And with that said, though we want to consciously focus on making informed and deliberate design decisions, we want to tend to avoid doing the coincidentals or the accidental ones or the ones we're stumbling across. We want to have a certain amount of focus within our designs using the various types of visual language and design tools available to us to express what we need to say. And what I'm essentially getting to is that even a skilled painter cannot save bad design. And let's look at two examples of this. So first up, we're going to look at this very example done by me. Now on the left, this is what I initially did. I had this idea, this grand idea of this robot and this nice little bird with a dog and a wolf kind of walking through the forest. Now the problem is this image is about those characters. And what I failed to do at a design level, at a construction level, is to have those characters be more readable. They're getting lost in the rhythm of the trees and the patterns of light behind them. It's just not expressing those clear enough. And so, even though the texture is on point, the lighting looks fabulous, the detail is all in place, the atmosphere is there, fundamentally it's a bit broken. It's just not working. And so what I had to go back and do is fix it on a deeper structural level. You know, I had to go in underneath all that and end up repainting a good lot of the background to just simplify around it, have a variety of larger and smaller shapes, and to of course increase that pattern and rhythm of design in it. And therefore it, in my opinion anyway, it's a lot more readable. And up next is this illustration done by a former student of mine. Now, this is a great example that this structure in this image is kind of so poor. It's just not ever going to bring out the actual idea. You know, the idea of this undead sort of zombie Western rider. It'll never kind of reach its full potential, even in the hands of an extremely skilled painter, a painter that is well versed in the subject matter, somebody like a Jeremy Fenske or a John Park, very skilled at painting the subject matter. If you gave them this structure of the image and just told them to paint over it without structurally changing anything, it would still always be a fairly poor painting, because the proportions are off, the anatomy is awkward, the cropping is weird, and the arrangement of shapes isn't that dynamic. And that just goes to show you that nothing can really compensate for bad design. Now that we've established a basis for what design is, I think the logical next question would be, what is good design? For many, this can mean a number of things, and perhaps meaning can change depending on the subject. If I had to sum it up, though, in a very general way, it would be in two words: clarity and purpose. Good design is not just what looks great, but it performs on some sort of functional level, ultimately fulfilling its purpose while simultaneously hitting notes on an emotional level. So, does a design look great, have a clear purpose, and make you feel something? Or does it feel generic, confuses you, or looks rushed and unrefined? So how do we go about designing itself? There must be a secret technique or a tried and true formula. Well, yeah and no. Design for most people is widely considered to be a fairly subjective topic, though I'd argue there's even more objectivity to good design and what goes into making good art. Let's start this by looking at how we can compartmentalize the aspects of design and see the core techniques that work for strong design and art. And so what we have is design, which is to plan and to organize. And we do that with creative problem solving using the elements and principles of design. And we are left with the visual solution, which is derived from the creative problem solving, which is the design, your sketch, your concept, your painting. It can really be anything. So let's now see this in context. To plan and to organize is to establish what the problem and goal is. In our case, it's to design a sleek, modern train. At this stage, we also may want to do some necessary research and referencing. Now let's use the elements and principles to form the basis of our idea. First, we can often start with a few simple lines, and enough lines will eventually come together to start to form shapes. Now, we want to keep arranging these patterns of lines and shapes and forms to fill our design needs. If we use enough contrast in these lines, making some short, some long, some straight, some curved, we can achieve an interesting design. This works with other principles as well, such as having rhythm and movement of lines and shapes, or maybe it's perhaps using colors in certain ways to achieve an emphasis. The final result will be one of infinite possible visual solutions. Alright, so moving forward, I feel that this train, when we're comparing these two, I do feel the right one is objectively better, or more interesting anyway, than the one on the left. Just speaking of the lines, the shapes, I would say these are all arranged in a more visually interesting way. And that's all I'm getting to. I think the same amount or level of technical skill is applied to each of these, but it's just the arrangement of them. It's how the patterns of shapes or the rhythms of lines really come together to make this one just a little bit more eye-pleasing. And that's what I would say makes for a stronger design in this particular case. It's It's really how these elements of design are being used effectively. We will primarily be focusing on lines put together can make shapes, and of course with different shapes and lines we can make pattern. These will be our primary tools as designers, as we'll be learning how to manipulate these, how we can express what we need to from them, and how our artistic voice can be seen through the manipulation of them. And these are really just a kind of combination of the principles and elements of design. Right? Some people get confused on these two kind of categories of design, but to put it simply, right, the elements of design are our tools, and the principles are kind of like the rules or guidelines in which we use these tools. So feel free, of course, to check these out. Now, just to show you as a brief example, using just line up here, right? So here's our tools, right? Our tools will be line, in this one, shape, and form, right? So let's use them using the pattern, right? So here's, for example, a pattern of lines, a pattern of shapes, and then a pattern of form, right? So we can apply a different principle to all the various types of elements. And of course there's an infinite number of different ways to really go about this. This is just kind of one little minute example. So let's look at a few different artists that really can use these different elements and principles to their advantage. First up, a master of line, Ian McHugh, a very popular artist. We can see in these sketchbook pages of his how he gets in there and aggressively and gracefully manipulates line on a page to get his ideas across. So this is a very linear way to approach environment design, right? We're just combining different lines basically to make a few different shapes. We have a shape of a cloud here, the shape of a sky made up in here. The rocks have a patterned use of line, in turn making a sense of rhythm to express the texture. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. Some lines are thin, some lines are thicker, some lines are shaded in to represent negative and positive space. So there's a lot of great ways to go about this. Here's a great example of a master of shape, and that's Rob Ruppel. We could see throughout his different paintings here how he really focuses on the manipulation and expression of these shapes to create a very strong artistic voice in what he's expressing here. Whether it's the chunky, lumpy, free-flowing sort of shapes throughout the beach dune here, to the chaoticness of the branches of the trees up here, and of course to the static use of squares juxtapose the organic curved shapes of the environment in this cityscape. Theo Prins is one of my favorite artists that really gets in a rhythm and pattern throughout his designs. There's a lot of people that try to emulate and copy his style, but they're often missing the point. If you really break down and look into any little facet of his design or work, it's an intricate relationship and play of various types of patterns that are making different types of rhythms, and of course it has very solid value structure, right? Like light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. That constantly is used to express these various types of principles. So yeah, he's very good at that. Some areas are simple, some areas are complex, some areas are medium. The use of contrast and how we can create balance in our designs by not overdoing any one aspect or element. Alright, so some of that may seem a bit heavy. There's a lot to kind of process. Is there a simple way to approach compositional design with a few values, using line, shape, a pattern and stuff? And I feel that there is. I was taught that there's something called the designing principle, and that's just a fancier term for a simple approach to the matter. And what this is considered is the breakdown of compositional design to its core, the underlying idea in your image. the foundational structure in a sense. And that's really just about the focal point, right? Most of our images are always about something called a focal point. And what the designing principle does is it helps curate that focal point. It helps us make sure it's loud, it's clear, it's direct, and it gives the elements in our picture a reason to exist. And it gives the viewer a method of looking at it. So the designing principle is always a simple thing. This is our strategy, that's shape-based. Some of these can be path-based. And last up, value pattern-based. Now this is a simple thing, and what it's going to inform us is what we see through to the end. These designing principles are always based off the focal point. See, if I make a quick pass just over each of these, it's very easy to distinguish the focal point in each scene. It's right here, it's right here, it's right here. And it takes a second to kind of gauge that. Or if, a composition's done well, it should take a second to gauge that. So let's look at these individually now and kind of assess what these are. Often when designing these value comps, it's best to start at the focal point, right? The core idea. Start in that general area. So in this case, right, it may be, okay, well, you have a person, a grave, right, horizon line. Then design the entire rest of the comp, using shapes kind of around that. How can we frame that? And gradually just add other supporting bits of information in regards to these shapes as needed. So, see, this is a great example of a scene that is primarily shape-based. We have a shape of white value here. We have a shape of white value here. We have some nice darker shape values. And it's all about every shape in this, whether it's this negative shape, it's very dynamic and pushes the viewer's eye to that focal point. And this triangular white frame of light on the house, right, that's kind of bridging the two, bringing our eye right to it. It's a very nice shape design. Now path can be a little more subtle, and it can't be a little more subtle in some cases. An easy way to approach this is, right, if we have our focal point, which is going to be, right, exhibit A, which is the man, and we have the grave, right, how can we get the viewer's eye there? Well, this technique, path-based, uses a variety of lines and shapes and value, right, dark against light, to push the viewer's eye right to where we need it to go. So see, like, all these shapes, in some form or another, are pushing the viewer's eye to that. And that's what it's all about. See, even this line over here, boom, this line here. Every line is acting to support the main actor or the main subject matter on screen, right? This and this. Everything supports that. And they're all using swooping lines to kind of push. Now, these ones do as well. Value and shape do as well, but it's not the strongest. Like, it's when it's the strongest way to show your composition, it would be considered path. Now, value, that's a fun one, right? This is just about coming up with interesting patterns and rhythms. In this case, right, we have dark, we have dark. This is all dark, 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 right? It's a nice arrangement of dark. And in this case, we're blessed with some very obvious light patterns, right? And they're just, where we look at these light patterns, we have some nice trickled lights. It's much smaller shapes over here to balance it out, and some heavier ones all right here around the light on dark, or the dark on light composition. Now the gray that we see in here and in here, that's just kind of the negotiators. It's the intermediaries in this case between some of the harsher contrast in the scene. But everything makes a very nice, intricate pattern of value, light on dark, dark on light, and so on and so forth. And it's really what the image is about. All right, so next, let's look at how we can use lines and shapes to really establish and embellish this landscape here, going from a simple reference. Since there is no value in this particular demonstration, we're not going to be looking for any kind of patterns and rhythms of value. We'll be trying to establish all of that just with lines, and eventually these lines are going to make those shapes. And this is a great way to practice, particularly for beginners, because you're not kind of making things too complex too soon. So the red line, I'm establishing where that horizon line is, because that is the absolute first thing to figure out when drawing landscapes and in environments. And what I'm doing here with these lines to draw these mountains is I'm not trying to draw them one for one. I'm trying to find what the essence is, in a sense, for what these mountains, because obviously my lines are quite a bit more simple, and that's just to, like, if I can draw or represent the same idea or image but kind of doing it in a more simple and elegant way, then that's going to hit some of my goals for this. So in a scene like this, what I could do is make some mountains taller, some mountains are shorter, and again, I'm really pushing these lines, being conscientious of which ones are tall, which ones are short, which ones are long, things like that, to really help change that rhythm up of these lines that are making up that mountain. And of course, what we're left is a bunch of shapes. Now at this stage, this really doesn't have any kind of focal point in the original reference, so I want to imagine that there's some kind of house situated at the base of this mountain on a very small hill. And I'm going to start to draw and integrate that in to my version of this scene. And I call it my version because you could give that same reference to 10 different artists and they would all have their own reality, based off that. Because that's how design is, and that's how, the imagination kind of can tend to work. Because there's not a right or wrong answer with these things. So I'm just basically setting up the stage here to figure out a little simple farmhouse way, way back up on the hill. So I'm going to represent that in red since it's the potential focal point. And basically, now that I figured this out fairly early on, I can design and draw every other line in this scene now to really service that as the focal point. Like in my head, what I'm thinking is, how can I get the viewer's eye to there and basically take them not so directly, but in, around, over, and through the composition. It's a delicate dance. So I'm going to start to draw out, that basic road that's in the foreground from the reference, but I'm going to change the angle of that. I'm going to change the shape up a little bit. I'm going to embellish it to really help service this focal point now. So I want to, start a little bit over to the left, sling them over to that mid-ground, swoop them over, down the little valley. So I'm adding a lot of terrain to this otherwise very flat scene as well, without really changing what that overall message actually is. Just making it more visually palatable, I would say. Something to give the viewer something to, sink their teeth in. So see, it's like just kind of flowing with those lines and those shapes right there. It's just making it just a little bit more pleasing to the eye. I haven't even started to tackle the trees yet, but I'm just trying to lay in that foundation at this stage for what that visual path is. And since this is a road, that's very much a literal path. Now, how that mountain, right behind that house has that big long shape going right down to it, that would be considered a visual path, since it's not quite as literal as like a road. So again, I'm trying to represent and figure out what these patterns and rhythms of the tree lines are. And I want to make, think of it like a heart rate monitor. I want to beep, beep, beep. I want to have a very kind of high rhythm of those. I don't want it stagnant, like beep, beep, beep. I want to change it up. Small ones, large ones, long ones. And I'm going to represent, like everything else in this scene, these trees with a fairly simple symbol. Right? This is not representational at this level. This is a purely kind of construction drawing to establish what the design is. And again, really what the goal here when working with a direct piece of reference like this in a design standpoint is I'm trying to find the essence of what this scene is about. And then again, giving it my take. So I'm making this little shrub here that's against a telephone pole. I'm removing that telephone pole altogether, and I'm going to make that into a larger tree. That tree is now overlapping many of the areas in that, as well as these trees off to the left of that. See, in the reference, there's just like that one little cluster of trees. So I'm adding a much greater variety for what those trees are doing now shape-wise. And then pushing some extra trees over here on the right, technically kind of in the foreground now. And the reference doesn't really have that, but I feel this adds, a little bit to the scene. So that's the other question I'm generally considering at every stage of this, is what I'm adding, servicing that focal point is what I'm adding, enriching the idea or the scene. And if not, I'm going to try to like actually remove stuff and simplify it. And these trees are also working to service the scale and the depth in the scene. Like we know, like right up in the foreground, that's how big it is. And we're echoing that shape going all the way back along that road. And of course, against the farm that I'm, setting up for in the back. So again, if I were to take this to full color or even value, then that would be a whole other layer of design that I could begin to tackle in regards to kind of figuring out, what's that design DNA in this image. And I can, of course, layer multiple approaches on that as well. And I think that's what makes something as simple like this, a great exercise and something to work towards to even practice even the simple fundamentals of design itself. So see, if I were to add a little bit of form lines and contours to these shapes for the mountains to kind of make them more three-dimensional, I could also do that now to service that focal point. I can have these lines, which is something I'll cover in a later video called the form of action, but they're all going to kind of lead us and frame that focal point as well. So again, it's another subtle level of design that I'm very deliberately making these decisions to do. So nothing's really left to chance, nothing is accidental, and every little line, shape, and curve I'm putting into this is very much intentional. And that's the goal here. So every line starts with a singular point, and once that point is in motion, that's what creates the line. And of course, once we combine these lines, or a number of lines, we can have a shape. And of course, once we go further than shapes and go into 3 dimensions, we can then start to have forms. Now let's take a closer look for a sec at these lines. There's 3 types. We have the C curve, the S curve, and the straight. We can basically create any number of shapes, patterns, and rhythms with those 3 types of lines. And it's great, again, to really add contrast with those. Some will be curvy, some will be sharp, some will be smooth. Some may be small, some may be fast, some may be slow. Or in this case, complex and simple, right? So here's a medium, here's a large, a medium, too small, a small, a large, a medium, right? This is the very, very basic foundation of what makes for good and interesting design. And it comes down to a very simple level of drawing. Simple, complex, medium versus small, etc., etc. So when we start to take these lines, right, how do we embellish them? How do we put them into patterns and establish rhythms with them? Alright, so I'd like to just take a bit of a moment to break down in some actual finished work how lines, shapes, and patterns really kind of play into the design here. So here's one example from me. I'm going to go in, lower the contrast just so it's a bit easier for me to draw over. Right on the next layer here. So this is all about lines. There's a lot of lines going in it, and you can see some of the lines on a very basic level kind of going like this, which are a bit straighter. Now there's other lines as well that are kind of using more of a compositional element. So they're working on multiple levels. Like that's going like that. This is kind of going right in and out and back like that. There's a lot of lines over here as well, kind of pushing us toward that. So everything in this scene, line-wise, is kind of pushing our eye to about this area. This is the major focal area and region of the shot. So lots of things are kind of playing up to that in one way or another. Now, in regarding the lines as well, it tends to get a little bit more complex over, right, and in the composition. And then it's also, which I'll highlight in green here, it gets pretty simple over here, a bit more simple right here, a bit simple in here. So I'm trying to balance that out. And of course, on a very micro level with these lines, I'm really trying to utilizing those rhythms as well. So some of those are straight, right? Some of those are curved, but a lot of them, some of them are long, some of them are short. Some of them are C curves, some of them are S curves, right? It has kind of a lot of that in the structural DNA of it. Now, in regards to shapes, it's doing that with the shapes as well on a lot of fronts, right? So like, here's a shape, for example, of a highlight. Here's another shape, roughly of that highlight. Here's another shape of a highlight. So everything is very, right, clearly defined in an easily traceable and articulated shape, which again, I'm going to cover more in the later videos. Some of you already may even have seen those. But good shape is really, again, the foundation of really nice designs. Everything else that I don't really have selected here, I would actually kind of consider in shadow. So everything but the sky in terms of like the ground plane. Right, that's all shadow, that's all shadow, and then everything in here is, again, shadow as well. So I'm trying to very carefully establish that shape hierarchy. Now, in regards to patterns, I think that kind of comes more, in regards to the brushwork seen here. So you'll see like there's a lot of, stippling, patterns with the brushwork kind of going into here. There's a simple kind of pattern with the rock itself that is going, something kind of like a wedge shape like that. So I'm trying to find that beat and that rhythm. There's also a certain amount of pattern that it gets bigger and more flat-like with the various areas and types of rocks in desert. And then, of course, we have the other element as well in this, that you could see some very rough, desert foliage, some tufts of grass here and there. So as you can see, this is kind of like the pattern and the rhythm that is coming out in terms of texture and in terms of brushwork. So I'm thinking about this on every level of the design, from the very basic level at the foundation all the way to the finished product. And of course, we could see that same pattern and rhythm as well coming through with the rocks themselves. So right here, right, that's a major rock shape. There's a cluster of medium ones over there and right here. Then there's a whole bunch of little tiny ones, to balance all of them out, spread throughout, right, the composition as well. So all these pieces are trying to get along with each other. They're trying to mingle to kind of serve, right, that overall greater purpose. Let's look at one more example here with this kind of cloudscape with a beast in it. I guess it's a kind of a dragon or wyvern here. So I'm going to do the same thing, just lower that overall contrast. We're going to come in here. Now, in regards to the lines and the shapes, they're doing something fairly simple, right, and direct. Something like that. We have this as a giant web shape, pushing us right over to here. And then again, these are kind of supplementing that by further bringing us up. We may have a shape and a direction, right, kind of going like that. This line here is going to bring us to that line. This line here is going to bring us over to there. This is going to establish that horizon line that we can see throughout many different parts of it. And of course, we have lines kind of creating ripples and waves in regards to breaking up some of those. So, right, we have C curves, there's S curves, there's straights, there's a lot more straight lines in forming patterns for the trees like that. And of course, we have the softer, wavier lines. They're making up the clouds. So these are a bit softer, they're a bit slower. They're taking their time. But again, every shape and every line in this design is working toward one goal, and that's to getting the viewer here in a fairly creative and fun way. How everything else does that, it comes down to just a little bit of planning, a little bit of trial and error. It's nothing that kind of comes out first try, but it's all kind of working again together. So if we're talking more about the form lines of things, right, there's a general kind of flatness underneath these all that are going like this, right? That's kind of help softening some of that information. There's that echoed in the flatness of the water. And of course, we have different lines implying different types of forms, stuff going like this, where there's actual grass, right? And then there's mountains. So lines are really found throughout the entirety of this image, whether they're like something actually visible or not visible. Now, the shapes are, or as you can see here, fairly similar, right? Like this is all one massive, right, clean shape. The water, right, that's a shape. That's a shape over here. The water's a shape over here. Go back to pink for the landmass right here. I carefully tried to plan all these little shapes out bit by bit so that they look, again, dynamic and they have a certain flow and rhythm to them. And of course the clouds, right, they're doing their own shapes, and these shapes are again made up of lines. Like here's a medium curved one, here's a small curved one, here's a large curved one, right? Medium, small, it's going off the page at that point. And these as shapes, right? Here's a fairly, I guess a medium or a medium one. Here's an overlapping medium one. But those are all kind of, getting overshadowed by this massive shape, that makes up all that, all the clouds there. And then, of course, there's a smaller shape right there. And again, a nice big, medium one right there. So there's like patterns, shapes, and lines throughout the whole design, throughout the whole painting, whether it's from the planning stage to the final brushwork to the visual aesthetics of it, in regards to like, okay, here's a bunch of tree shapes, right? Here's a big cloud shape. Like those are the aesthetics. Those I actually kind of figure out a little bit later in the design itself. Now for a few closing reminders. Principles are the ways in which we use the elements. The rules can be broken and the techniques do change, but principles are absolute and forever. How we use these elements of design really define our own individual styles. And our jobs as visual designers is often just to take reality and to make it fun, engaging, and marketable. Find a process that works well for you. It is just a way of managing the fundamentals. Good design will always require good planning, execution, and refinement. So if you don't know where to start, establish what the problem is you're trying to solve first.